stands to lead a more coherent and less idolatrous life, but it also provides a helpful critique and corrective to the incoherent ideology of our political culture. And in fact, several hopeful cracks, I think, are already starting to form. In the recent political battle for healthcare reform, the anti-abortion Democrats wield tremendous power in that legislation. Another interesting way of thinking involves the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, both being against big government, big business amalgams. Right? I think that's an interesting coherence. It goes beyond the liberal conservative binary. A 2009 Gallup poll found the following breakdown in political affiliations. Very conservative, 9%. Conservative, 31%. Moderate, 35%. Liberal, 16%. Very liberal, 5%. And all indications, that's not a liberal conservative binary. And all indications are that these cracks are going to become gaping holes as millennials come into their own. This is a group of young people, including many evangelical Christians, who at once generally support traditionally liberal causes of health reform, while at the same time trending more pro-life or anti-abortion. Indeed, Gallup claims that 18 to 29-year-olds are now roughly tied as seniors as the age most likely to hold that all abortion should be illegal. And this is what they call a sharp change from the 1970s, when seniors were substantially more likely than younger age groups to be in this position. Where does an evangelical Christian who insists on government-supported health care for all and wanting to ban abortion fit into our liberal conservative binary? They are hardly moderate. They don't fit into any of the other categories either. My experience teaching millennials is they know better than their parents and grandparents that a two-dimensional binary approach just can't capture the level of complexity necessary to interpret and analyze our most pressing issues and problems. So my method as a moral theologian is to show that the Christian tradition of the seamless garment, or the consistent ethic of life, is not only far more authentically connected to our Christian tradition, but is far better able to deal with the complexity of the important issues and principles facing us today, especially in the new century. Instead of thinking about our values and principles in ways which best fit the currently accepted wisdom of a political ideology, we should instead apply our traditionally Christian values and principles consistently across many different kinds of issues, and often in ways which prophetically trouble those standard answers to the 1970s. But now I know to any non-Catholics who you may know the consistent ethic, having been most energetically defined and defended by the former Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Bernardine, comes directly from the tradition and current official teachings of the Catholic Church. However, many of the relevant insights and arguments, because they come from the gospel of Jesus Christ as revealed in Scripture, can be engaged and accepted by many non-Catholic Christians as well. Especially because, as we will see, the ethic is so connected to the gospel values which Jesus enjoined upon us, biblically focused Protestants will find that it resonates with them as well. At least I hope so. When you come to lunch, maybe we talk about that. Indeed, many different kinds of Protestant thinkers will be absolutely essential for fully articulating a consistent ethic of life for our 21st century and go beyond the 1970s categories. Many have already made very substantial contributions to that. And the most important contribution so far was made by David Gushing himself with his very important book on the sacredness of human life. In fact, one reason that David and I have developed such a good friendship is because we both espouse something like a consistent ethic. If you haven't read that book, please read that book. Furthermore, many of the relevant ideas and arguments are specifically addressed in the consistent ethic, not just to Christians, but all people of goodwill. And I propose that many who have faith in something other than Christianity will also find deep resonations with the consistent ethic. We'll see about that. So what's the consistent ethic? I thought this is what the talk was about. Here are some principles I just want to lay out. First, with regard to moral status and value. I think that's the foundational first move. The starting point for the consistent ethic is the irreducible dignity of the human. Persons are sacred and have dignity such that they are ends in themselves and cannot be reduced to other ends, merely reduced to other ends. Persons are also social and can only realize their dignity by flourishing in relationships, particularly in community truly consistent ethic acknowledges the moral value of all lives, including those of non-human animals in the broader ecological world. This is part of the broad concern for the universal common good, not just the common good of human beings. Taking our cue from the example of Jesus, the consistent ethic's concern for life should have a special focus on the flourishing of the most vulnerable, Matthew 25. And consistency requires that we do this regardless of species, age, condition of dependency, net contribution to the economy, race, gender, class, health, wealth, power, or moral condition. Now, if the consistent ethic is just a list of values, it'll be impoverished. It needs the virtues, in my opinion, if it wishes to reimagine and reorient our lives in the way that I hope we do. Again, from those 1970s categories. In such a way that it can become predisposed to actively and consistently living it out. Though there's a unity of virtues, I think the two most important virtues for a consistent ethic are first, peaceableness. Though it may allow for rare examples of violence in defense of oneself or another, the consistent ethic has a presumption against using violence, and especially against aiming at the death of another person and actively acting against life in other ways. It requires that one give special attention to the effect of both the obvious harm this does to the attacked, but also to what happens to the attacker, the kind of habits that are formed, PTSD, etc. And also, the second virtue that's important is charity, obviously. We need to go beyond merely refraining from harm, but merely active love that God has in our lives, again, with a particular focus on the most vulnerable. For it is in these most vulnerable that Jesus himself comes to us. So we have principles, two virtues. Now let's talk about a few rules. It wouldn't be a Catholic, to talk for some I like to call them principles. Without rules, we not only fail to respect the value that the principles and virtues protect, but we are left flying blind, it seems to me, with only our values and virtues to guide us through complex and difficult situations. Keeping in mind that moral rules, even those that are exceptionless, are designed to promote the authentic flourishing of both the agent and the effective. Here are what I think to be the most significant ones that I believe should guide action if you're living out a truly consistent ethic. First, it is always wrong to aim the death of an innocent person, in part because it radically reduces the dignity of another to a mere means to an end. Persons are ends in themselves. Period. This is true with regard to the killing of oneself or the killing of another, whether that killing is by action or aiming at death by omission. You can aim at death by refusing not to. When done out of love or concern for one's neighbor, one may very rarely, again with the consistent ethic, use violence as a means of protection against a non-innocent person, an aggressor. The use of deadly violence, however, must be strictly regulated and must be, among other things, the last resort. The consistent ethic is not pacifist, but again, it has a presumption against violence. One has a very strong duty also, not just again to refrain from harm, but to support and sustain the lives of persons in need, again, especially the most vulnerable. And one cannot support or sustain the lives of persons in our contemporary culture without focusing on social structures which connect and disconnect us from each other. Especially given Jesus' focus on wealth and our duties to the poor, we should have a special skepticism for the social structure of consumerism. The consistent ethic also insists that we should follow Jesus by having a particular focus on hospitality and welcome for the stranger who is present to us but not connected to our community, perhaps especially when that person is inconvenient for the community. The duty to sustain the vulnerable is an essential part of what it means to follow Christ. And often that's missing from a lot of pro-life rhetoric. It's not just refusal to kill, it's about sustaining the vulnerable. And most of the sin, actually, we commit, I argue, have little to do with our actions, or most often have little to do with our actions, but are more directed at our omission. In fact, that seems to be the main sexuality. I think most of us are aware that our sexual culture has become a violent one. In fact, sexual violence is at epidemic levels, especially at college campuses. I looked up the statistic this morning. 20% of women will experience attempted or completed sexual assault during their undergraduate years. 1 in 5. And no one should be surprised by this. Our culture has been pornified, such that the paradigmatic sexual act, especially in college, is the mutual and raw use of another's body for one's own purposes, one's own end. Often this is explicitly done without consent, as one or more participants drinks to the point where they aren't capable of making a consensual decision. Indeed, that's part of the point of drinking to death. The consistent ethic resists this hookup culture, not only on the basis of its inherent violence, but on its closed nature to life. Contraception is the tool which makes the hookup culture possible. Without contraception, sexually active people cannot pretend that they are merely using another person without consequence. Understanding sex is ordered by openness and hospitality, both to your partner and to any life that may result, is the anti-hookup culture, and I think an example of the consistent ethic at its best. How about biotechnology and reproduction? Our understanding of sex directly impacts on these two, obviously. Instead of seeing procreation as something that is a gift connected with sexuality, we now see it as a will choice, often disconnected from sex. Often, because our consumerist culture forces us to do so, people wait until relatively late to have children, and often it doesn't happen to them. Infertility is a huge, huge thing in our culture and a source of tremendous pain. But because procreation is seen as a choice rather than a gift, we now think it perfectly normal to use technology to create children as tools of our will. They become a product that is actually made and sold. And like many products, people want quality control, even use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis of embryos to make sure the right embryo is being implanted and the wrong embryo is simply thrown away. I think this is exactly what Pope Francis means when he talks about a culture, a throwaway culture. Interestingly, we've basically dropped the language of procreation in our culture and now talk about reproduction. Even the language of the market and consumerism is in the very language we use to describe it. I gotta tell you, these fertility clinics make a tremendous amount of money. Tremendous money. Not just from people purchasing their product, but the consumerism also is involved in women selling their eggs and uteruses as part of the market transaction. And often it's poor women who are exploited in this. I'm going to have the easy ones, right? Abortion. Abortion is a violent act that snuffs out an incredibly vulnerable, independent human life. Happens 1.2 million every year, 1.2 million times every year in this country. The prenatal child cannot speak for herself. She cannot be her own defense. And her dignity is wildly inconvenient for many of us. It is especially inconvenient for men who would prefer to participate in the hookup culture without such consequences. Against the idea that children are merely products to be accepted or abandoned at will, the consistent ethic resists violence and welcomes the child, even perhaps especially when she is inconvenient in the spirit of hospitality. Jesus gave us a clear command: let the little children come to me, and don't ever stop. The consistent ethic takes this command very seriously. What about poverty and social justice? In laying out the demands of protecting and sustaining our prenatal children, we should have no illusions. This can be an incredibly burdensome thing for mothers, and especially poor mothers. The consistent ethic refuses to choose between the dignity of women and the dignity of their children, especially when they are both vulnerable populations. If one holds the consistent ethic, we ought to change our culture fundamentally when it comes to supporting women and mothers. Women ought to receive equal pay for equal work. They ought to receive robust protection against discrimination in the workplace, long and paid maternity, on-site child care, including opportunities to breastfeed and or pump breast milk, and universal pre-K and other opportunities duty is not to kill, and our duty is to aid. And lastly, with regard to specific issues, let's talk about animals. Now, concern for non-human animals might seem like an odd choice for the consistent ethic of life, but I absolutely think they belong. Humans are animals, made on the same day as our fellow non-human animals. And though I think even the most vulnerable human animal is worth more than the most sophisticated non-human animal, I think it is clear that many non-human animals have a high moral status that we are bound to respect. Our culture is already there, isn't it? Those who torture dogs and other pets are already scorned and sometimes even thrown in jail. Mike Vick is a classic example. God calls animals good, period. Genesis 1. And brings them to Adam in Genesis 2 because it is not good man should be alone. Animals are even seen as playing an important role in the redemption of all creation in the new kingdom of God, where Isaiah tells us that the peaceful kingdom includes all animals, not just humans. The lamb, lion, snake, and human will all live peacefully together in paradise, at least if we believe in God. Animals, of course, also cannot speak for themselves, and we also find their dignity wildly inconvenient. Treating them with the dignity they deserve might mean that we can't eat the dishes we love to eat, or at least not eat them at the prices we like to buy them. Or do the most promising research to cure the diseases we want, especially if it requires using very sophisticated primates. But this is precisely where I think a consistent ethic needs to step up and speak for vulnerable populations on the margins. And furthermore, I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the horrific violence to which we should subject animals in factory farms and research laboratories. That violence is intentionally kept hidden away so that we don't have to see it, or be reminded of it, and certainly be reminded of our complicity in it. Instead, we go merrily along, participating in a consumerist culture which rewards factory farms and drug companies for treating animals this way. They get our money, we get our food and drugs. Why be consistent? Living out a consistent ethic is hard. It not only means rethinking how we live our comfortable lives, it also means being politically homeless in an American culture dominated by the liberal conservative binary. Why, at the end of the day, should we be consistent? An old philosophy professor of mine used to say that having a moral principle is like riding a bus and not like riding a taxi. This is an important metaphor to use with my New York City students. By this he meant that, like riding a bus, having a moral principle means you must follow it wherever it goes. Unlike riding a taxi, you don't get to tell where your principles end up. Some implications of the principle, perhaps due to your and my comfortable political commitments, may be difficult to accept. But that's just too bad. We're obligated to suck it up and consistently follow our principles wherever they lead us. If we find ourselves unable to consistently apply a principle, perhaps we need to check ourselves and ask ourselves honestly whether we believe it's true. Perhaps it's time to get on a different bus, take a new path, find a new principle. This is a perfectly acceptable and even noble response when one is confronted with our own inconsistency. What is not acceptable, I argue, is pretending that having a principle is like taking a taxi. We don't get to tell our principles when they apply and when they don't apply. We don't get to allow self-deception, willful ignorance, or anything else keep us from consistently applying our principles. In fact, this kind of inconsistency, in my view, is what allows radical injustice to flourish and leaves many vulnerable populations on the margins, subject to terrible violence, because our polarized discourse doesn't allow us to address it. nation state, especially our borders, right? The God of our sexual reproductive autonomy, and of course the God of the political